Two decorated deputies drove out onto Highway 59 one October night and were never seen again. Their patrol car found abandoned at Carter Bridge. Radios dead, shotguns missing, no bodies, no answers. For 25 years, Pine Bluff lived with whispers, a sheriff's secrets, cartel money on back roads, and a killer named only in shadows. Until now, stay with us, because the story buried here is darker than anyone imagined. Subscribe for more true crime investigations. The highway was empty. A thin ribbon of asphalt cut through the vast Texas plains, swallowed on either side by darkness. The clock on the dashboard read 2:14 a.m. as Officer Daniel Mercer leaned back in the driver's seat of Unit 117, his eyes flicking between the road and the silent, endless fields. Beside him, Officer Luis Vega scribbled notes onto a clipboard, his brow furrowed in concentration. They'd been running patrol since 10 p.m., answering routine calls, a drunk and disorderly at the Texaco, a domestic argument that fizzled out before they arrived. Now the radio was quiet, save for the occasional hiss of static. "You ever notice how this stretch feels different?" Luis asked suddenly, breaking the silence. He tapped his pen against the clipboard. "Like, emptier than it should." Daniel smirked. "It's the middle of nowhere, Luis. What do you expect? A carnival?" Luis shook his head. "No, I mean it. I've driven plenty of back roads, but this one feels wrong. Like we're the only ones left on Earth." Daniel didn't answer. He adjusted his rearview mirror, catching his own tired reflection. 42 years old, 20 of them on the force, and he still pulled graveyard shifts. His wife hated it, said it was killing him slow, but he liked the quiet. Out here, the world made sense. Rules, routine, radio chatter. The cruiser's headlights cut across a faded mile marker, 314. Luis tapped the glass. "We're close to the old Carter Bridge, yeah?" "Couple miles," Daniel confirmed. The Carter Bridge. Locals whispered about it. Kids dared each other to drive across at midnight, swearing they heard screams beneath the boards. Daniel dismissed it as nonsense, but still. He kept his eyes fixed on the road as the darkness thickened. The radio crackled. A voice came through, faint, distorted. "Unit 117, report your location." Daniel reached for the mic. "This is Unit 117. We're on Highway 59, about 3 miles north of the Carter Bridge." All quiet static answered him, then silence. He set the mic back in place. Luis frowned. "Dispatch cutting out again?" "Storm interference," Daniel said, though the sky was clear. They drove on. The hum of tires against asphalt became hypnotic. Luis yawned, scribbled one last note, then leaned his head back. That was when Daniel saw it. A set of taillights, glowing faintly ahead, like two red eyes floating in the dark. A car pulled onto the shoulder, hazard lights blinking. Daniel slowed. "Stranded motorist?" he muttered. As they drew closer, he noticed the car was old. A late 70s sedan, paint dulled, one tire shredded. The driver's door hung open. Luis sat up. "Guys out walking?" "No idea." Daniel pulled in behind the sedan, angled the cruiser for cover, and flipped on their overheads. Blue and red lights strobed across the empty fields. Both men stepped out. The air was cool, unnervingly still. Daniel's boots crunched gravel as he approached the sedan. "Hello, Sheriff's Department," he called. "Anyone here?" Silence. The car smelled faintly of gasoline. Daniel ran his flashlight across the interior. Empty. No wallet, no keys, no driver. Luis circled to the trunk, testing the latch. Locked. "Daniel," he said softly, "this doesn't feel right." Daniel was about to answer when a noise broke the silence. Footsteps. From the darkness beyond the ditch. Both officers froze, flashlights snapping toward the sound. "Sheriff's Department," Daniel called again. "Show yourself." A figure emerged. Male, tall, thin. His hands hung loosely at his sides as he stepped into the beam of light. His face was shadowed beneath the brim of a hat. "Car broke down," the man said, voice flat. Daniel felt a chill crawl up his spine. Something about the tone, emotionless, rehearsed. "Sir, step over here," Daniel ordered, keeping his hand near his holster. "We'll get you some help." The man didn't move. His head tilted slightly like a bird studying prey. Luis shifted uneasily. "We'll call a tow, okay? Just step toward the cruiser." The man smiled. It was wrong. Too wide, too slow. And then, darkness. The dashcam footage, recovered later, showed nothing more. Just two silhouettes in the distance, flashlights swinging toward the ditch, then the lens abruptly cutting to static. When a highway maintenance crew drove that stretch at dawn, Unit 117 sat abandoned, lights still flashing. The sedan was gone. The two officers were gone. No blood, no struggle, just silence. For 25 years, the disappearance of Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega would remain one of Texas's most disturbing cold cases, whispered about in diners, dissected on late-night radio, speculated on in online forums. And for 25 years, no answers came. Until the summer of 2023, when a construction crew unearthed something buried beneath mile marker 314, something that would change everything. The sun had just begun its climb when the jackhammers fell silent. Dust drifted lazily in the air above the construction site at mile marker 314, settling on steel-toed boots and fluorescent safety vests. The crew foreman, Eddie Ramirez, wiped his brow with the back of his glove and glanced at the hole they'd carved through the asphalt. It was supposed to be routine, a new pipeline installation, nothing unusual. But now the men stood in a loose circle, eyes fixed on something half buried in the dirt. Eddie crouched, peering into the shadows. What he saw tightened his chest. A shape. Rusted. Jagged. The corner of a bumper. "Old car," one of the workers muttered. "Yeah," Eddie replied, though unease prickled at the base of his neck. This wasn't just some abandoned junker. This was deliberate. The earth around it was packed tight, as if the vehicle had been laid here, not crashed. "Keep digging," Eddie ordered, voice low. "Careful now." The backhoe operator maneuvered his machine with painstaking precision, peeling away layers of soil. With each scoop, more of the car emerged, a hood crumpled inward, windshield fractured into a spiderweb of cracks. By the time the roof was visible, Eddie had already dialed 911. "Sheriff's office, what's your emergency?" "This is Eddie Ramirez, foreman on the 59 expansion project. We just hit a vehicle underground. Looks like it's been here a long while." There was a pause on the other end. Then, "Stay put, sir. We'll send deputies right away." Eddie hung up, throat dry. His men shuffled uneasily, whispering among themselves. Nobody liked this stretch of highway. Too many stories, too many accidents that didn't make sense. Within half an hour, two sheriff's cruisers rolled up, lights flickering in the early morning haze. Out stepped Detective Sarah Collings and Deputy Troy Hill, both in plain clothes, but with the unmistakable authority of law enforcement. Sarah, tall and lean with sharp eyes, introduced herself with a firm handshake. She studied the half-buried vehicle in silence for several moments, her jaw set. "Get the perimeter secured," she told Troy. "Nobody near this thing until forensics arrives." The workers were ushered back behind the caution tape. Eddie lingered, arms crossed, watching as Sarah crouched near the car. Her gloved hand brushed away soil from the license plate. The letters emerged slowly, caked with rust but still legible. TX7FJ-412. Sarah's breath caught. She knew it. Not personally, but from the old case files, the ones that had been whispered about in every precinct she'd worked. The highway disappearance. She stood, dusting her hands. "We need to call this in," she said. "Now." The news broke by noon. A local station ran aerial footage of the site, their helicopters circling overhead as deputies swarmed the scene. Reporters clustered at the edge of the construction zone, microphones thrust forward, questions shouted. Sheriff Alan Dorsey stepped to the makeshift podium, sweat darkening his collar in the midday heat. At approximately 7:45 this morning, a construction crew uncovered a vehicle buried beneath Highway 59 near mile marker 314, he began, voice steady though his eyes betrayed tension. The preliminary investigation indicates the vehicle may be connected to the 1998 disappearance of officers Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega. As you all know, this case has remained unsolved for 25 years. The crowd erupted, questions overlapping, cameras flashing. Sheriff, are there human remains in the vehicle? Was it deliberately buried? Does this mean foul play is confirmed? Dorsey raised a hand, silencing them. We're still in the early stages. Forensics teams are on site now. What I can confirm is that the vehicle matches the description of the patrol unit Mercer and Vega were driving on the night of their disappearance. That's all I can say at this time. Sarah stood to the side, her eyes scanning the sea of reporters. She felt the old weight of the case pressing down on her shoulders, though she hadn't even joined the department until a decade after the disappearance. Everyone in law enforcement knew the story. 2 officers, gone without a trace. Cruiser abandoned, then vanished. Whispers of cover-ups, of secret deals gone wrong, and then nothing. The trail had gone cold before she'd ever worn a badge. Now the past had clawed its way back to the surface. By evening, the highway was closed in both directions. Portable lights bathed the site in sterile brightness as forensic crews worked methodically, cataloging every inch of the buried car. Sarah pulled on a fresh pair of gloves and joined the lead examiner, Dr. Yvonne Kessler, at the driver's side. The door had been pried open with hydraulic tools, revealing an interior preserved by soil and silence. It's definitely the unit, Kessler confirmed, voice muffled behind her mask. She gestured to the cracked radio, the faded upholstery, the faint outline of the sheriff's emblem on the dash. No doubt about it. Sarah's flashlight beam swept across the front seats. Empty. No uniforms, no bones, just dirt and rust. Where are they? Sarah muttered. Kessler didn't answer. She was bent over the back seat, tweezers delicately lifting something from the floor. A scrap of fabric, darkened with age, threads frayed. Sarah leaned closer. It was navy blue. Uniform? She asked. Looks that way. Kessler sealed the scrap into an evidence bag. But this is just the beginning. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. She stepped away, answering with clipped efficiency. Collings, a voice crackled through the line. Sheriff Dorsey. Sarah, I just got off the phone with the chief. This case is ours now. Cold case unit will assist, but your lead. I want you on it full time. Sarah exhaled slowly, eyes drifting back to the half-exhumed car. Understood. And Sarah? Dorsey's voice softened. This is going to stir things up. People never forgot Mercer and Vega. Tread carefully. The line went dead. Sarah slid her phone back into her pocket and returned to the vehicle. She crouched again, staring into the hollow darkness of the driver's seat. Somewhere, 25 years ago, 2 men had vanished into the night, their cruiser buried like a coffin beneath the asphalt. Someone had put it there, and whoever it was had been waiting, silent, as the years passed. Sarah felt it then, the chilling certainty that whoever had buried the car hadn't meant for it to be found. The earth had secrets, and they were just beginning to surface. That night, the footage played on every channel. Drone shots of the car, headlines screaming, "Break in 25-year-old highway disappearance." Interviews with aging relatives, with neighbors who remembered the night the officers vanished. But beneath the frenzy, a quieter current ran. Online forums lit up with speculation, old conspiracy threads resurrected. Some swore Mercer and Vega had stumbled onto a cartel shipment. Others claimed corruption, that the men had been silenced by their own department. Still others whispered darker things, that the highway itself swallowed people, that mile marker 314 was cursed ground. Sarah ignored the chatter. She sat in her office, case files spread across her desk, eyes red from reading reports until dawn. Every page carried the same unanswered questions. Every lead had ended in silence, but now there was a car, a physical anchor in the fog of rumor, and Sarah Collings was determined to follow it, wherever it led. The knock on the door came just after breakfast. Margaret Mercer set down her coffee mug, her hands trembling as though she already knew who stood on the other side. She hadn't heard from the sheriff's department in years, not since the last update that told her nothing new. Yet the sight of Detective Sarah Collings on her porch pulled her straight back to that September morning in 1998, when her husband never came home. "Mrs. Mercer," Sarah said gently, removing her sunglasses. "I'm Detective Collings. May I come in?" Margaret nodded, wordless, stepping aside. The house smelled faintly of lavender polish and old paper. Sarah noticed framed photographs on the wall as she entered. Daniel Mercer in uniform, his mustache thick, eyes kind. Daniel holding a baby girl, her hair tied up in ribbons. Margaret led her to the living room, lowering herself into an armchair. Her movements were slow, careful, as if she carried invisible weight on her shoulders. "You've found something," she said quietly. Not a question. Sarah took the seat opposite. She had practiced the words on the drive over, but they still caught in her throat. "Earlier today, construction crews uncovered a buried vehicle off Highway 59. We believe it is the patrol unit your husband and Officer Vega were driving the night they disappeared." Margaret's face went still. Only her hands betrayed her, gripping the armrests until her knuckles whitened. "Was he inside?" No remains were found in the vehicle, Sarah said carefully. "But we did recover material consistent with uniform fabric. Forensics is still processing the evidence silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating." Finally, Margaret spoke. "For 25 years, I've prayed for an answer. I thought maybe the Lord had forgotten me. But now?" She trailed off, eyes glistening. "It feels like Daniel is speaking from the grave." Sarah leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I need your help, Mrs. Mercer." Old memories. Anything unusual from that time. Small details might matter now. Margaret nodded slowly, though her gaze drifted toward the photograph of Daniel on the wall. "I remember the night clear as yesterday," she whispered. "He kissed me before leaving for his shift. Said it would be quiet. He promised he'd bring home breakfast tacos in the morning." Her voice broke on the last word. Across town, in a modest brick home shaded by pecan trees, Rosa Vega set out 2 cups of coffee at her kitchen table. She did it every morning, though the second cup always grew cold and untouched. When Sarah arrived, Rosa ushered her inside with quiet hospitality. The house was filled with the warm, earthy scent of beans simmering on the stove. Family photographs lined the shelves, Rosa with her children, her husband Luis in his crisp brown uniform, his smile wide and easy. Sarah explained the discovery gently, watching Rosa's face carefully. Rosa closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. "I knew this day would come," she said. Her accent softened her words, but her tone carried steel. "I prayed for it." "Did you ever receive threats?" Sarah asked. "Anything unusual before Luis disappeared?" Rosa hesitated, then nodded. 2 weeks before, there was a phone call, a man's voice. He said Luis should stop asking questions. "What kind of questions?" Rosa's eyes filled with shadows. Luis was stubborn. He believed some of the higher-ups were turning a blind eye to cartel traffic along the border. He wanted to prove it. I told him to be careful. But he said the people needed protecting. Her hands trembled as she gripped the coffee cup. And then, one night, he was gone. Sarah made careful notes, though her chest tightened. 2 officers on a quiet patrol, yet both had reasons someone might want them silenced. Margaret's Daniel, known for his integrity, unlikely to look away. Rosa's Louise, outspoken against corruption. The puzzle pieces had been scattered for decades. Now, with the car unearthed, they demanded to be assembled. By afternoon, Sarah returned to the station, where files lay stacked across her desk. Old case notes, faded photographs, witness statements yellowed with age. She opened one of Daniel Mercer's reports from the summer of '98. Scribbled in the margins was a phrase that made her stomach clench. Something rotten at Carter Bridge. Sarah sat back, the air thick around her. Carter Bridge. Locals whispered about it. Kids dared each other to cross it at night. But, in law enforcement circles, it was tied to rumors of drop-offs, meetings no one ever admitted to. She pulled another file. A statement from a trucker who swore he'd seen flashing lights near the bridge around the time Mercer and Vega disappeared. At the time, the claim had been dismissed as unreliable. But now, the buried cruiser lay only 3 miles from that bridge. Sarah leaned forward, her pulse quickening. Someone had tried to erase this case, bury it beneath asphalt in silence, but the ground had given up its secret, and the families who had waited a quarter of a century were about to learn the truth, no matter how dark it might be. That evening, Margaret sat alone in her living room, the television flickering with news coverage of the discovery. She muted the sound, unable to hear strangers dissecting her husband's fate. Instead, she stared at the framed photo on the wall. Daniel's eyes seemed to look back at her, steady and kind. "They found your car," she whispered. "What else will they find?" Across town, Rosa lit a candle in front of a small shrine to St. Jude, patron saint of lost causes. She whispered her husband's name into the flame. For 25 years she had lived with absence, with questions that clawed at her dreams. Tonight, she felt something shift. Not peace, not yet, but momentum. The dead were stirring, and soon, so would the truth. The bridge stood in silence, stretching over the sluggish brown waters of the San Jacinto River. In daylight it looked ordinary. Concrete pylons streaked with rust, the guardrails scarred with graffiti. But Sarah Collings knew its reputation. To the locals, Carter Bridge was cursed ground. Kids whispered about headlights vanishing in the night, about screams carried on the wind. Truckers swore they avoided it after dark. And for years, police officers had dismissed those stories as superstition. But Sarah had seen the files. Daniel Mercer's scribbled note. Something rotten at Carter Bridge, burned in her mind. And now, a buried patrol car had surfaced just 3 miles away. She parked her unmarked sedan on the gravel shoulder and stepped out. The September air was heavy with humidity, clinging to her skin. The smell of algae rose from the water below, mingled with faint traces of oil and exhaust. Her boots echoed on the asphalt as she walked the length of the bridge. Every sound felt amplified. The rush of cars in the distance, the hollow thud of her footsteps, the river gurgling beneath. Halfway across, she stopped and leaned against the guardrail. From here, the drop was steep, the current deceptively strong. The river wound away between banks thick with cottonwoods, their roots knotted like arthritic hands. She imagined 2 officers pulling over late at night, flashing lights in the dark. A scuffle, maybe, a decision to make someone disappear. She closed her eyes and let the silence stretch, as if the bridge itself might whisper what it had witnessed. Back at the station, Sarah dug deeper. She requested traffic records from 1998, searching for unusual reports near the bridge on the night Mercer and Vega vanished. Most logs had been destroyed in a flood years ago, but one fragment remained. A call from a payphone at a roadside diner, timestamped 2:13 a.m. The caller had reported flashing lights near Carter Bridge. Looked like cops in trouble. The note in the file was marked unsubstantiated. The diner had since closed, the payphone removed. Still, the timing was too precise to ignore. Sarah stared at the faded report until her vision blurred. Someone had seen something. 2 nights later, she returned with a search team. Floodlights illuminated the bridge, casting long shadows on the water. Divers prepared their gear, their wetsuits gleaming wet under the harsh light. The night air was cool, laced with the metallic tang of river mud. "Target zone is 50 yards upstream," Sarah directed, pointing to an eddy where currents slowed. "Start there." The divers slipped soundlessly into the dark water. Sarah gripped the railing, watching their beams of light cut through the murk. Every minute felt like an hour. Then, a flash of something metallic beneath the surface. "Contact!" one diver shouted through his radio. Moments later, they surfaced, dragging a sodden object between them. It clanged against the deck as they lifted it. A dented steel flashlight. The grip corroded. The battery long dead. The initials LV were faintly scratched into the casing. Sarah's chest tightened. Luis Vega. Forensics bagged the flashlight carefully. But it was what came next that sent chills down Sarah's spine. One diver emerged holding a strip of fabric, waterlogged but still clinging to its original form. Navy blue, with traces of a badge-shaped outline at the shoulder. A uniform remnant. News traveled fast. By morning, reporters crowded the department steps, demanding answers. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. Is it true evidence linked to the missing officers was recovered? Are you treating this as homicide? Do you believe foul play was involved? Sarah kept her responses measured, her voice calm. We are conducting a thorough investigation. Evidence has been recovered and is undergoing analysis. At this stage, all options remain open. Behind her words lay the truth. This was no accident. Mercer and Vega hadn't simply driven off into the night and vanished. Someone had forced them into silence, and gone to great lengths to keep it that way. That evening, Sarah sat with Margaret and Rosa again. She placed the flashlight on the table between them. Both women stared as though it were a holy relic. "That was Luis's," Rosa whispered, her voice trembling. "He always carried it. Said the department-issued ones were too weak. He scratched his initials so no one would borrow it." Margaret reached for Rosa's hand. Together they wept, silent tears falling onto the wood grain of the table. Sarah watched them, her throat tight. She had delivered proof of loss, but also proof of existence. The men had left something behind. Their voices had not been completely erased. Later, alone in her apartment, Sarah spread the evidence photos across her coffee table. The flashlight, the fabric, the buried cruiser, and the single note. Something rotten at Carter Bridge. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about 2 officers caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was about something deeper. Corruption, secrets, maybe a betrayal from within. She poured herself a glass of water, her hands shaking slightly. 2 men had gone out to protect their community. 2 men had never come back. And now, 25 years later, their case was clawing its way back into the light. Sarah leaned back in her chair, the night pressing in around her. The bridge was no longer just a structure of concrete and steel. It was a witness, and it was time to make it talk. The old sheriff's department files smelled of mildew and dust. They had been boxed up years ago, stacked in the archives like forgotten coffins. Sarah stood in the basement of the county records building, the flicker of fluorescent light overhead making the shadows twitch. She tugged on gloves and pried open a box labeled Mercer/Vega, 1998. The folders inside were thin, too thin. An entire disappearance. 2 deputies gone without a trace, reduced to a couple dozen sheets of paper. Sarah flipped through them. Initial missing persons reports, copies of witness interviews, grainy maps of the search grid. But what struck her most was the absence. No ballistics, no internal memos, no investigative leads beyond the first 2 weeks. It was as though someone had slammed a door on the case and walked away. At the station, Sarah called in an older contact, retired Sergeant Bill Kearns. He had worked under Sheriff Harland back in the late 90s and was known for his sharp memory. Kearns met her at a roadside diner, his frame stooped but his eyes alert beneath his weathered cap. Over coffee, Sarah slid the thin file across the table. "You were there," she said. "Tell me why this case went cold so fast." Kearns tapped a cigarette from a crumpled pack, though he didn't light it. His hands trembled slightly. "Because nobody wanted it solved," he said finally. Sarah leaned in. "Meaning?" Kearns lowered his voice. Sheriff Harland was old school, kept things quiet. He had friends who liked it quiet too, ranchers, truckers, men with money in all the wrong places. When Mercer and Vega went missing, Harland called it an accident before the search was even finished. Told us not to stir it up. Why? Kearns stared at his unlit cigarette. Because they'd been poking around Carter Bridge. And Carter Bridge was where deals got made. What kind of deals? His voice dropped lower. Drug runs, weapons, human cargo sometimes. The cartel didn't own this county, detective, but they rented it. Sarah's stomach clenched. And Harland? Turned a blind eye. Maybe got his cut. I never had proof, but the whispers were everywhere. And Mercer and Vega. Kearns finally met her eyes. His own were red-rimmed, weary. They weren't the kind to look away. That's why they didn't come home. That night, Sarah combed through personnel files. Sheriff Harland had died in 2009. Most of his inner circle had retired or moved away. But one name jumped out. Deputy Raymond Cole. Cole had been the last officer to see Mercer and Vega alive. He'd radioed them from a gas station the night of their disappearance, claiming they were headed toward the bridge to check out a suspicious vehicle. His statement was brief, oddly vague. Sarah found Cole's current address, a rundown trailer on the edge of town. The man who opened the door was in his late 50s, his frame sagging from years of cheap beer and hard living. His eyes darted nervously when he saw Sarah's badge. "Detective Collings," she introduced herself. "I'd like to ask you a few questions about Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega." Cole stiffened. "That was a long time ago. I know, but new evidence has surfaced." He hesitated, then let her in. The trailer smelled of stale smoke and fried food. A muted television flickered in the corner. "They told me not to talk about it," he said, lowering himself into a recliner. "Who told you?" Cole's jaw worked. "Harland. Said the case was closed. End of story." Sarah pulled out her recorder. "What did you see that night?" Cole rubbed his temples. "I saw their unit parked by the bridge. Lights flashing. Looked like they had someone pulled over. When I slowed down, another car was there. Dark sedan. 2 men inside. Suits, not locals." He swallowed hard. "When I came back 10 minutes later, the unit was gone. So was the sedan." "Why didn't you say this in your statement?" Cole's voice cracked. "Because Harland told me to shut my mouth. Said if I liked my job, I'd forget what I saw. And I did. For 25 years, I tried to forget." Sarah's pulse thudded in her ears. "Did you recognize the men in the sedan?" Cole shook his head. "No, but they weren't strangers to Harland. He called one of them by name when they met later that week." Sarah leaned closer. "What name?" Cole's lips trembled. "Carnes, Charlie Carnes." The name landed like a stone in Sarah's gut. Carnes, a shadow figure she'd seen whispered in old narcotics reports. A man tied to cartel supply lines but never charged. The kind of name that slipped through cracks because it was protected from both sides of the law. "Where is Carnes now?" she asked. Cole's eyes darted toward the window, as though someone might be listening. "Still around," he whispered. "And if he knows you're asking questions, you better watch yourself." Back at her apartment, Sarah replayed the recording. Cole's shaky voice, the name Carnes, the image of a dark sedan by the bridge. The picture was coming into focus. Mercer and Vega hadn't vanished randomly. They had been silenced, buried beneath corruption and fear. And if Carnes was still out there, living comfortably after 25 years. Sarah set her jaw. The dead had waited long enough. It was time for the living to answer. The name lingered like smoke in Sarah's mind. Charlie Carnes. She had read it before, buried deep in narcotics task force reports from the late 90s. Carnes was the kind of figure investigators whispered about but rarely wrote down. Too slippery, too well connected. Some said he worked for the cartels. Others said he worked for himself. What everyone agreed on was this. When Carnes appeared, people disappeared. Sarah began with public records. Charlie Carnes, born 1961 in Galveston County. A handful of petty arrests in the early 80s. Bar fights, stolen property. All dismissed. By the 90s, he had reinvented himself as a logistics operator, running a fleet of trucks between Houston and Laredo. Officially, it was produce and freight. Unofficially, DEA files hinted at shipments that never passed inspection. But Carnes had never served a day in prison. His charges dissolved, witnesses recanted, and his money flowed into local campaigns. Sheriff Harland, she noticed, had received a suspiciously large donation the year before Mercer and Vega vanished. Sarah's chest tightened. The web was there, faint but undeniable. She drove south to Houston, the city's skyline rising out of the haze. At a dimly lit bar near the docks, she met with an old DEA contact, Agent Frank Morales. Carnes, Morales repeated, shaking his head. That ghost? Haven't heard that name in years. He was connected to Mercer and Vega, Sarah said. Their disappearance. I need to know what you know. Morales sighed, swirling the ice in his glass. Charlie Carnes was smart. He didn't flash guns, didn't brag. He smiled, shook hands, made people feel like they owed him. When product came north from Mexico, Carnes arranged transport, trucks, warehouses, middlemen. If something went wrong, someone else took the fall. He was a spider in the middle of the web, always just out of reach. Sarah leaned in. And now? Morales' eyes flicked toward the window, where the neon buzzed. Now he keeps a low profile. Owns a salvage yard outside San Marcos. Harmless, if you ask the locals. But the old-timers know better. Once you've had blood on your hands, it never washes clean. Sarah's pulse quickened. A salvage yard. The same kind of place where Mercer's cruiser had been found. Coincidence? Or a pattern? The next morning, Sarah drove to San Marcos. The salvage yard sat on the outskirts of town, a sprawl of rusting cars and twisted metal fenced with barbed wire. The sign out front read, Carnes Auto Salvage. A young man in greasy coveralls looked up as Sarah entered. Help you with something? I'm looking for Charlie Carnes, she said, flashing her badge. The young man's expression tightened. Don't think he's here. Where can I find him? He hesitated, then shrugged. Try the office. End of the row. Sarah followed a gravel path through rows of junked cars, their broken headlights glaring like blind eyes. At the far end stood a low cinder block office with a faded metal door. She knocked. After a pause, it opened. The man who stood before her was in his 60s, his hair gray at the temples, his frame still broad. His face bore deep lines, but his eyes were sharp, watchful. Detective, he said smoothly, as though he had been expecting her. To what do I owe the pleasure? Charlie Carnes. That's me. His smile was polite, practiced, but Sarah felt unease coil in her gut. This was not a man caught off guard. This was a man used to visitors, used to scrutiny, and used to surviving it. I'm reopening the Mercer and Vega case, Sarah said. 2 deputies who vanished in 1998. Their patrol car was found not far from here. Carnes' smile didn't falter, but his eyes flickered. Tragic thing. I remember hearing about it. But that was a long time ago. You knew Sheriff Harland, Sarah pressed. "Records show campaign donations from your trucking company." Carnes chuckled. "Supporting your local sheriff, is that a crime now?" Sarah held his gaze. "It depends what you were buying." The air thickened. Carnes leaned back against the door frame, crossing his arms. "Detective," he said softly, "I've been in this town a long time. Folks know me. If I had anything to do with those officers, don't you think it would have come out by now?" "Sometimes the truth takes time," Sarah replied. Carnes studied her, his smile fading. For a brief moment, his eyes hardened, flat and cold. Then the mask returned. "Well," he said, opening the door wider, "if you want to look around, be my guest." "You won't find anything but old junk." Sarah left the yard unsettled. Carnes had offered nothing, no slip of the tongue, no visible fear. Yet something about him gnawed at her. Back at the station, she ran his financials. Several LLCs tied to his name, all funneling money through shell companies. Recent property purchases, including a farmhouse in a rural county west of Austin. And then she found it, a deed transfer for a plot of land near the San Jacinto River, dated 1999, less than a year after Mercer and Vega disappeared. The land sat less than 2 miles from Carter Bridge. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the names circling her mind. Mercer, Vega, Harland, Carnes. The spider had spun his web long ago, and somehow 2 honest men had walked right into it. Now, years later, Sarah was tugging at the strands, and spiders, she knew, never liked being disturbed. The warrant arrived before dawn. Sarah read it twice, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. For weeks, she had been circling Charlie Carnes, watching the shadows he cast. Now she had permission to drag a light into them. By the time she reached Carnes Auto Salvage, the yard was shrouded in mist. Dew clung to the twisted frames of cars stacked like tombstones. A convoy of cruisers followed her in, tires crunching over gravel. Officers fanned out, weapons ready, their flashlights cutting through the fog. Carnes emerged from his office as though expecting company. He wore pressed jeans and a clean shirt, his silver hair combed back neatly. If he was surprised, he didn't show it. "Detective Collings?" he said smoothly. "Bringing an army, I see." Sarah held up the warrant. "We're conducting a search." He smiled faintly, spreading his arms. "Be my guest." The salvage yard stretched for acres. Rows of cars sat in varying states of decay. Doors rusted off, windshields shattered, seats crawling with vines. The air smelled of oil and wet iron, tinged with something sour that Sarah couldn't place. Teams began systematically turning over the wrecks. Hoods popped open, trunks groaned, dust and insects rose into the morning air. For the first hour, they found nothing but rust and ruin. Then a shout echoed from the north corner. "Detective! Over here!" Sarah hurried across the gravel. 2 officers stood beside a pile of crushed metal, one pointing at a narrow pit behind it. The ground there was uneven, the soil disturbed. "Fresh fill," one officer said. "Couple months, maybe less." Shovels bit into the earth. Within minutes, metal scraped against metal. Together they unearthed a sealed steel drum, its surface streaked with rust. The lid was pried open. Inside lay bundles of clothing, water-damaged but intact. Navy blue fabric, badges dulled with time. Sheriff's Department uniforms. Sarah's throat closed. 2 uniforms, Mercer's and Vega's. The discovery cracked the yard open. Beneath another mound of wreckage, officers found a cache of items. Police radios, a shattered pair of handcuffs, a leather wallet containing Daniel Mercer's ID. Sarah knelt, brushing dirt from the badge, her chest aching. For years, Margaret had waited for proof her husband hadn't simply abandoned her. Now here it was. Grim, undeniable. A radio crackled from the far side of the yard. Another unit had found a small outbuilding, locked tight. A bolt cutter sheared the chain. Inside, shelves lined the walls, tools, spare parts, and in the corner, a cardboard box filled with personal effects. Sarah pulled on gloves and lifted the lid. Inside were photographs, dozens of them curled with moisture. All showed deputies in uniform, candid shots from community events, parades, station gatherings. Mercer and Vega appeared in several. Some were circled in red ink. Sarah's skin crawled. These weren't keepsakes. They were trophies. By noon, Carnes was in custody, seated at the station under harsh fluorescent light. His demeanor remained calm, almost amused, as though the uniforms and photographs were inconveniences, not evidence. "You've been busy," he said, glancing at the stack of evidence bags. "But you're chasing ghosts, Detective. Those uniforms could have come from anywhere. Old stock. Surplus." Sarah leaned across the table, her voice low. "They had Mercer's name tag, Vega's initials. Their blood is on the fabric. That's not surplus, Carnes. That's murder." For the first time, his smile faltered. Only for a second, but Sarah saw it. A crack in the armor. "You've been carrying their ghosts for 25 years, she pressed. "But ghosts have a way of clawing out of the dirt." Carnes sat back, his expression hardening. "Be careful, Detective. Some ghosts don't rest because they're not meant to. You start pulling at threads, you'll find more than you bargained for." That evening, Sarah stood outside the salvage yard again. The sun dipped low, staining the sky orange. Reporters swarmed the fence, cameras flashing as officers carted out the last of the evidence. She stared at the pit where the steel drum had been unearthed. The earth still gaped, raw and scarred. Beneath her boots, the ground had hidden secrets for decades: uniforms, badges, photographs, artifacts of betrayal. But one truth remained out of reach. Where were the men themselves? Mercer and Vega had not yet come home, and until they did, Sarah knew this case was far from over. The farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by acres of fallow land. Its paint peeled in long strips, windows clouded with dust. An old windmill creaked in the breeze, its blades casting fractured shadows across the weeds. Sarah killed the engine and let the silence settle. The property deed had led her here, purchased under one of Charlie Carnes's shell companies in 1999, just months after Mercer and Vega vanished. She stepped out of the car, the air sharp with the smell of dry earth. Crickets pulsed in the grass. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Her partner for the day, Deputy Troy Hill, adjusted the strap of his vest and scanned the horizon. "Place looks dead." Sarah shook her head. "Dead things leave traces." They approached the porch. The door hung crooked, its lock rusted. Troy forced it open with a grunt, the hinges groaning like an old wound. Inside, the farmhouse smelled of mold and decay. Dust coated every surface. Yellowed wallpaper curled at the seams. The kitchen sink was rusted through, dishes still stacked in the drying rack as if someone had walked away mid-meal and never returned. Sarah's flashlight beam swept the floor. Rat droppings, empty beer cans, a mattress in the corner, stained and sunken. "Somebody's been squatting," Troy muttered. "Or hiding," Sarah replied. They began a room-by-room sweep. The living room yielded nothing but broken furniture. The upstairs bedrooms were empty save for piles of rotting clothes. But in the back of the house, down a narrow hallway, Sarah found a locked door. The wood was newer than the rest of the house, reinforced. Troy frowned. "That doesn't fit." They pried it open. The smell hit them first. Metallic, sour, unmistakable. Blood. Sarah gagged, pulling her shirt over her mouth. The flashlight beam revealed a small, windowless room. The floor was concrete, stained dark. Hooks jutted from the ceiling, chains dangling. Against one wall sat a rusted chair with restraints bolted to the arms. It was not a squat. It was a chamber. Sarah's hands shook as she snapped photographs. "This is where they brought them," she whispered. Troy's jaw clenched. "Mercer and Vega?" Maybe. Maybe others on the far wall, carved into the plaster, were words scrawled by hand. Some letters were smeared, but Sarah could read them. "We didn't run. They buried us." Her chest tightened. She traced the grooves with her gloved hand, imagining a man's last desperate attempt to be remembered. Forensics teams swarmed the farmhouse by nightfall. The room was sealed, samples taken from every inch of concrete and wood. Sarah stood outside, arms crossed, her stomach knotted. She had seen crime scenes before, but this one was different. It carried the weight of years. The silence felt layered, as though voices still echoed from the walls. Carnes had built this place, a secret space outside the county, far from prying eyes. And if the uniforms at the salvage yard were trophies, this farmhouse was something darker. It was where men vanished. The next morning, Sarah briefed Sheriff Dorsey. His face was pale as he studied the photographs. "Jesus," he muttered. "They built a dungeon." Sarah nodded grimly. Carnes didn't work alone. This took planning, money, protection. Mercer and Vega were silenced because they threatened more than just him. Dorsey rubbed his temples. "If this comes out, it'll tear the county apart." "Then let it tear," Sarah snapped. "Families have waited 25 years. They deserve the truth." That evening, Sarah drove back to Margaret Mercer's house. The widow opened the door, her eyes red from crying. "We found a property," Sarah said softly, "connected to Carnes. There was a room. We believe Daniel and Luis may have been held there." Margaret's lips trembled. "Alive? For how long?" Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she placed a photograph on the table, the carved words from the wall. Margaret traced them with her finger, tears sliding down her cheeks. "He was trying to speak," she whispered. "Even at the end, he wanted me to know." Sarah's chest ached. She thought of Rosa Vega, lighting her candle each night, whispering her husband's name. She thought of Mercer promising breakfast tacos, of Vega scratching his initials into a flashlight. The men had been erased, but not forgotten. And now, piece by piece, the erasure was unraveling. As Sarah drove home, headlights appeared in her rear-view mirror, too close, too steady. She switched lanes. The car followed. Her pulse quickened. The road was empty, the night pressing in. The other vehicle stayed on her tail for miles, its beams glaring in her mirrors. Finally, at an intersection, Sarah swung into a gas station. The car slowed, lingered for a moment, then continued on into the darkness. She sat in her car, heart pounding, gripping the wheel. The message was clear. She was getting too close. The morning after the farmhouse raid, Sarah walked into the station to find silence. Conversations that normally buzzed through the bullpen died the moment she entered. Deputies lowered their eyes. Papers shuffled louder than necessary. She felt the shift in the air like a storm front. Someone had been talking. Sheriff Dorsey called her into his office. He sat behind his desk, his tie askew, his eyes rimmed with fatigue. A stack of papers lay in front of him, topped with an unsigned letter. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest, Collings," he said. "Council members are on the phone. County attorney wants to know why you're dragging an old sheriff's name through the mud." Sarah crossed her arms. "Because the mud is where he belongs." Dorsey's voice rose. "You think I don't know that? But the department barely survived Harlan's tenure. If word gets out, we had a black site torture room in a farmhouse." "It wasn't a black site. It was a killing room," Sarah cut in. Her pulse hammered, but her voice stayed even. "And if we bury it again, we're no better than he was." Dorsey exhaled, leaning back. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the air conditioner. Finally, he said, "Do your job." but keep it quiet. No leaks, no press. If this case blows up, it'll take the whole department down with it." The leaks began that afternoon. A reporter cornered Sarah outside the courthouse. "Detective, is it true blood evidence was found in a Carnes property? Are you investigating a cartel connection inside the sheriff's office?" Sarah froze. Cameras clicked. Microphones shoved toward her face. She forced a neutral smile. "No comment." Inside, her stomach churned. Someone was feeding the press details only an insider could know. That night, she met with Rosa Vega at the widow's modest kitchen table. The smell of simmering beans hung in the air. Rosa's eyes were tired, but her grip on Sarah's hand was firm. "They're trying to stop you, aren't they?" Rosa asked. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Someone doesn't want this case reopened." Maybe more than one someone. Rosa's lips tightened. "That means you're close." Her faith was unshakable, but Sarah felt the weight pressing heavier on her chest. Rosa's belief was a burden and a responsibility. She left the house with the widow's words echoing. "You're close." 2 days later, Sarah returned to the farmhouse with forensics results. The concrete stains were confirmed as human blood. DNA testing was still pending, but the early markers suggested a match to the Vega family. Sarah's throat closed as she read the report. Rosa had lit candles for 25 years. Now the flame had a name. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment. Evidence spread across her coffee table. Mercer's badge, Vega's flashlight, photographs of the farmhouse. She pored over them, trying to stitch the story together. The phone rang. She answered without looking. A man's voice, low, deliberate. "Drop it, detective, or you'll end up in the dirt with him." The line went dead. Her hand shook as she set the phone down. She replayed the voice in her head, calm, confident. It wasn't a random crank call. It was a warning. She checked her locks twice before going to bed. The next morning, Dorsey summoned her again. His expression was grim. "Internal Affairs is sniffing around," he said. "Someone's filed a complaint against you, says you're harassing retired deputies, fabricating evidence." Sarah stiffened. "Who?" "Anonymous," Dorsey said. "But we both know where it's coming from." "Carnes," Sarah said. "Or his friend still in uniform." Dorsey replied quietly. "Be careful, Collings. They're not just trying to kill the case, they're trying to bury you with it." Sarah drove to the salvage yard again, alone. She parked across the street, watching from behind her windshield. Workers moved among the wrecks, oblivious. The office door was closed, curtains drawn. She thought of the farmhouse, the carved words. "We didn't run. They buried us." The pressure was real. The threats were closing in. But Mercer and Vega hadn't run, and neither would she. Sarah turned the key in the ignition. If Carnes thought pressure would break her, he had underestimated the dead. The county records building smelled of mildew and stale air. Sarah's flashlight beam cut across stacks of boxes, each labeled in fading marker. She moved carefully, gloved hands brushing against cardboard that disintegrated at the edges. The official Mercer and Vega case file had been thin, too thin. But old-timers whispered about Harlan keeping shadow files, notes never meant for evidence logs. If those records existed, they wouldn't be in the main archives. They'd be here, buried under years of dust. Troy Hill joined her, lugging a box onto a table. "These are Harlan era," he said, coughing as the dust rose. They opened box after box, property deeds, traffic citations, old payroll records. Nothing useful. Sarah's patience frayed. Then, at the bottom of a stack, she saw it, a folder without a label. The paper was brittle, corners stained. She opened it slowly. Inside were typed memos, meeting notes, photocopied maps of Highway 59 and Carter Bridge. Names scrawled in the margins. And at the center, a sheet stamped confidential. Her heart pounded as she read. It was a memo from Sheriff Harlan, dated 2 weeks before Mercer and Vega disappeared. Coordination with CK for scheduled transfers. Deputies Mercer and Vega asking questions. Need containment. Sarah's mouth went dry. CK, Charlie Carnes. The memo wasn't coded. It wasn't careful. It was blunt. Carnes and Harland had worked together, and Mercer and Vega had been seen as a problem to be contained. Jesus, Troy muttered, reading over her shoulder. This is a kill order. Sarah nodded slowly. And we just found the smoking gun. The deeper they dug, the darker it grew. Another folder held photographs. Grainy surveillance shots of trucks crossing Carter Bridge at night. One image showed men unloading crates. Another captured Carnes himself, his face half hidden, shaking hands with Harland. Why wasn't this ever logged? Troy asked. Because Harland controlled the logs, Sarah said. Her voice trembled with rage. He built his own archive to keep leverage. But when he died, the files got lost down here. She sealed the documents into an evidence bag, her gloves slick with sweat. That night, Sarah sat in her apartment with the files spread across her kitchen table. She read every page, every margin note. Harland's words felt like fingerprints reaching from the grave. Transfers, containment, Carnes. The story was clear. Mercer and Vega had discovered cartel shipments moving across county lines under Harland's watch. They had pressed too hard, refused to look away. Harland had called Carnes. Carnes had silenced them. Sarah leaned back, staring at the ceiling. 25 years of silence. And now the truth was bleeding out of cardboard boxes. But proof was dangerous. Proof put her in the crosshairs. Her phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. Stop digging, Collings. Last warning, she stared at the screen until her reflection blurred. The next day, Sarah presented the files to Dorsey. He read in silence, his face pale, hands tightening on the pages. This could bring down half the county, he said finally. It needs to, Sarah replied. Dorsey looked at her with something like fear. Do you understand what happens when you drag Carnes and Harland's names into the light? Retired deputies, current officials, people who still hold power. They'll fight back. Sarah's jaw tightened. Then let them. The families have waited too long. Dorsey closed the file slowly. Be careful. You've got the truth now, but truth doesn't always keep you alive. That night, Sarah drove past Carter Bridge again. She pulled over, parking at the shoulder where Mercer and Vega's cruiser had once sat. The river below whispered against the pylons. She thought of the memo. Containment. She imagined Harland's voice, cold and dismissive. She imagined Carnes's eyes, sharp and watchful. She imagined two men, loyal to their badges, realizing too late that their enemy wore the same uniform. Sarah whispered their names into the night. Daniel Mercer, Luis Vega. The wind carried their silence back. But for the first time, Sarah felt that silence cracking. The buried files were no longer buried, and the men who had orchestrated their disappearance would finally face the light. The county courthouse was louder than usual. Reporters clustered by the steps, microphones raised, cameras blinking. Sarah pushed through them, her evidence bag pressed tight to her chest. Inside, the grand hall smelled of floor polish and old stone. Deputy Troy Hill waited near the stairwell, his shoulders tense. You sure about this? He asked. No, Sarah admitted. But waiting won't make it safer. They climbed to the 3rd floor, where District Attorney Albright's office overlooked Main Street. Albright was a hard woman with sharp eyes, her silver hair pulled back like a blade. She greeted them without warmth. You said it was urgent, she said. Sarah set the files on her desk. This is Sheriff Harland's hidden archive. It links him directly to Charlie Carnes, and it suggests Mercer and Vega were eliminated for uncovering cartel shipments. Albright's expression didn't flicker, but her hand tightened on the papers. She leafed through them with deliberate slowness. Finally, she looked up. Do you have any idea what you've walked into? Sarah met her gaze. I know exactly, and I know silence has killed this county long enough. News spread fast. By evening, Sarah's name was in headlines. Buried files tie former sheriff to cartel network. Local stations ran grainy photos of Harland with Carnes, broadcast the word containment like a drumbeat. But behind the noise, Sarah felt eyes on her. At the grocery store, on the street, in the rearview mirror. The unknown number texted again. Final warning. Walk away. She deleted it, but her hands shook on the wheel. 2 nights later, Sarah's doorbell rang just past midnight. She reached for the revolver she kept by her bed. When she opened the door, Reed Carraway stood on the porch. His face was pale, his eyes wide. They're coming for you, he said. Sarah's pulse jumped. Who? Everyone tied to Carnes. My father tried to shield you, but you've lit the fire now. They'll put you down before they let this out. Reed stepped closer, desperate. You need to disappear. At least until the DA decides what to do with those files. Sarah didn't move. The memory of his hands on the blue handbag still lived in her bones. Why are you here, Reed? Guilt? He flinched. Because I know what Carnes does to people who get in the way. And I don't want to see it happen again. The following morning, Sarah drove to the edge of Carter Bridge with Troy. The river rolled brown and endless beneath them. Harlan thought this was his graveyard, Troy said softly. Sarah nodded. But graves don't stay closed forever. She pulled a small recorder from her coat pocket. Carnes is still alive, and now he knows I've got proof Troy's head whipped toward her. You're going to confront him? I have to, she said. He's the last thread. The meeting happened in a roadside diner off Highway 59. Sarah chose the booth farthest from the door. The hum of the neon sign outside flickered across the glass. Carnes arrived late, wearing a faded ball cap pulled low. He slid into the booth opposite her, his presence like a shadow. You've made noise, he said. His voice was soft, almost kind. Sarah steadied her breathing. Noise is what happens when truth crawls out of the dirt. He smiled faintly. You think you've dug up truth. What you've dug is a grave. Your own. She pressed the recorder on, hidden in her pocket. Tell me about Mercer and Vega. Carnes leaned back, eyes glittering. 2 boys who believed a badge made them untouchable. But everyone has a price, and when there's no price, there's containment. The words slid from his mouth like oil. Sarah felt her throat tighten. You killed them. I didn't have to, Carnes replied. Others did what was necessary. Men like Harlan understood balance, and now you've tipped it. For a long moment, only the clatter of dishes filled the space. Sarah kept her gaze locked on him. You've lived in shadows for decades, she said, but shadows only last until someone lights a match. Carnes' smile faded. His hand twitched as if reaching for something beneath the table. The diner door opened. 2 state troopers walked in, scanning the room. Carnes froze, his eyes narrowing. Sarah leaned forward. It's over. The files are out. You can't bury them again. Carnes' jaw worked, rage tightening his face. Then he stood, his chair scraping. He walked out without another word. But Sarah knew the war had only just begun. That night, Sarah sat alone in her apartment, the recorder on the table. Carnes' voice replayed in the dim light. Containment. The word was enough. Enough to prove intent, enough to finally bring the case to trial. But Sarah also knew what Carnes had said was true. Graves didn't open without something, or someone, being dragged down into them. And she felt, with bone-deep certainty, that Mercer and Vega's fight was now hers. The storm rolled in fast over Pine Bluff, thunder flattening the air into a heavy silence. Sarah sat in her car outside the courthouse, headlights off, windshield blurred with rain. The evidence was already in Albright's hands. The memo, the photographs, the recording of Carnes' voice. It should have been enough, but it wasn't. The DA's office had gone quiet. No calls returned, no statements to the press. The files had disappeared into some hidden drawer, smothered by fear or politics. Sarah had learned one thing. Truth wasn't enough. You had to survive long enough to keep telling it. Her phone buzzed. A new text. If you want answers, Carter Bridge. Midnight. No signature, but she didn't need one. Her pulse drummed as she read it again. It could be Carnes. It could be Reed. It could be both. Troy told her not to go. He'd begged, in fact, when she showed him the text. It's a setup. They'll dump you in the river like Mercer and Vega. But Sarah couldn't let the past play itself out again. She holstered her revolver, started the car, and drove. The bridge loomed through the storm, its iron bones rattling under sheets of rain. Sarah parked at the shoulder, the same place Mercer and Vega's cruiser had been found. Headlights flared behind her. A pickup rolled up slow, engine grumbling. Reed Carraway climbed out first. He looked thinner, soaked through, his face drawn tight with fear. Carnes knows you've got the files, he said. His voice shook. He wants them back. They're already gone, Sarah replied. Reed's eyes darted to the shadows under the bridge. He doesn't believe that. He's here. A shape moved beneath the girders. Then Carnes stepped into the rain. His presence swallowed the night. You just couldn't leave it alone, he said, his voice carrying under the storm. Sarah held her ground. Neither could Mercer and Vega. Carnes smiled faintly. And look where it got them. He lifted a pistol, the black barrel glinting with rain. Reed flinched. Don't. She's not. Shut up, Carnes snapped, his eyes never leaving Sarah. You brought her here. That makes you useful. For now, Sarah's hand hovered near her revolver, but Carnes was faster, steadier. His eyes held no hesitation. You think those papers matter? He asked. Truth dies the second men like me decide it does. You've seen that already. Sarah forced herself to breathe evenly. You're wrong. The files are in state custody now. Your voice is on record. You can't silence everyone. Carnes' smile twisted. Watch me. He raised the gun higher. Before he could fire, Reed lunged at him. The two men slammed against the guardrail, the pistol clattering to the asphalt. Sarah dove, her fingers closing on the cold steel of the weapon. She rolled, aimed, then froze. Carnes had Reed in a chokehold, his arm clamped tight around the younger man's throat. Shoot me, Carnes growled, and you kill him. Reed gasped, his face purpled in the rain. Sarah's hands shook. The barrel tracked them both, her breath ragged. Let him go, she said. You don't give orders here, Carnes spat. You write obituaries. He dragged Reed backward, toward the railing. The river boiled black beneath them. Sarah saw it then. Carnes wasn't just threatening. He was going to throw Reed over. She steadied her grip. Last chance. Carnes' eyes locked on hers. Cold, calculated, certain, and Sarah fired. The shot cracked like lightning, echoing across the bridge. Carnes staggered, releasing Reed, his hand clutching his side. He snarled, lunging again, but Sarah fired twice more. Carnes collapsed against the guardrail, his body folding, blood darkening in the rain. For a moment, he stayed upright, glaring at her through the storm. Then he tipped backward, vanishing over the edge. The river swallowed him whole. Silence fell except for the rain. Reed dropped to his knees, coughing, clutching his throat. You killed him, he rasped. Sarah lowered the gun slowly. Her arms trembled with adrenaline. No, she whispered. The river did. They stared over the railing, but the water carried no trace. No body, no shadow. Just the endless churn of the current. Sarah felt a hollow pit open inside her. If Carnes had survived, he'd crawl back from the dark, and if he hadn't, he'd become the kind of ghost that never let go. Either way, The trap had been sprung, and she was still alive. She drove back through the storm, Reed silent in the passenger seat. The bridge receded behind them, but the weight of it pressed on her chest. Her mind replayed Mercer and Vega, the files, Harlan's memo, Carnes's eyes in the rain. The cycle had ended, or begun again. Sarah didn't know which. Morning came slowly to Pine Bluff. The storm had passed, leaving the streets damp, the sky a washed-out gray. Sarah sat at her desk in the sheriff's office, her hair still damp from the night, her clothes smelling faintly of rain and gunpowder. Across from her, District Attorney Albright read the official incident report. Her jaw tightened, but her voice was calm. So, Carnes fell into the river after sustaining multiple gunshot wounds. Sarah nodded. Current swept him away. No recovery, Albright set the papers aside. Then it ends here. Sarah leaned forward. No, it begins here. We still have the files. His voice on tape. The families deserve more than a shrug and a missing body. Albright's gaze lingered, then softened a fraction. The families will have their day. I'll see to it Sarah didn't thank her. Promises in Pine Bluff had always been cheap. 2 days later, a press conference filled the courthouse steps. Reporters jostled for space, cameras flashing. District Attorney Albright stood at the podium, the sealed evidence bag beside her. After 25 years, she announced, the disappearance of Deputies Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega can finally be traced to corruption and collusion at the highest levels of county law enforcement. Sheriff Harlan concealed evidence, colluded with criminal elements, and orchestrated the silencing of his own men. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Flashbulbs popped. Sarah stood at the edge of the crowd, her badge catching the weak sunlight. She didn't smile. Closure wasn't supposed to taste like ash. Albright continued, we honor the sacrifice of Deputies Mercer and Vega, who paid the highest price for their loyalty to justice. Their names will be entered into the state memorial, and their families will receive the recognition long denied them. The applause rose like thunder, but Sarah only heard silence. That evening, Sarah drove to the Vega family's small house on the east side. Mrs. Vega met her at the door, her face worn but her eyes alight with something close to relief. They told me, she whispered, clutching Sarah's hands. After all these years, they told me. Inside, photos of Luis lined the mantel. His patrol portrait, his wedding picture, a snapshot of him holding his infant son. Mrs. Vega pressed Sarah's hand to her cheek. You gave us back his name. You gave us back the truth. Sarah swallowed hard. I only carried the torch. He lit it. She stayed for coffee, listening to Mrs. Vega talk about her son, about the years of silence, the endless not knowing. When Sarah left, the sky was dark again, but her chest felt lighter. A week later, divers found nothing in the river. No trace of Carnes, no closure, just the endless churn of water swallowing secrets. Rumors spread fast. Some swore they saw him hitchhiking along back roads, dripping wet. Others claimed he was already south of the border. Sarah didn't dismiss the rumors. Men like Carnes didn't die easy, but she also knew he no longer owned the silence. The files had broken the dam. The county could never again pretend Mercer and Vega had simply vanished. On a clear Sunday morning, the sheriff's office held a memorial at Carter Bridge. Officers in dress uniforms lined the shoulder, their badges gleaming. Families gathered, faces streaked with tears. A granite marker had been set into the ground. The inscription read, in honor of Deputies Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega, for their courage, their sacrifice, and their unyielding pursuit of truth. 1998. Never forgotten. The river rolled beneath them, unchanged, but the weight of silence had shifted. Sarah laid a single white rose on the stone. Troy Hill stood beside her, his hand brushing his brow in a solemn salute. They deserved this, he said quietly. They deserved better, Sarah replied. That night, Sarah returned to her apartment. The files were gone now, sealed in evidence lockers, but their echo lingered in her mind. She poured herself a glass of water, sat at her table, and stared at the empty chair across from her. In the quiet, she imagined Mercer and Vega there, young, unbroken, still laughing at bad jokes on patrol. "Your fight's over," she whispered. "Mine's not." The city outside hummed with its usual darkness. Pine Bluff hadn't changed overnight. Corruption didn't vanish with a single press conference, but Mercer and Vega had names again. Their truth had cracked through decades of silence, and Sarah had survived the trap Carnes set. For now. She lifted her glass in a silent toast. "To the ones who kept asking questions," she said. The storm had passed, but shadows never fully lifted. Not here, not yet. 6 months later, Pine Bluff moved as if nothing had changed. The courthouse steps still filled with lawyers rushing in and out. The river still ran brown beneath Carter Bridge, and the neon diner sign still flickered at night. But for those who remembered Mercer and Vega, the silence was gone. Their names had been carved into the State Memorial Wall in Austin. Their families stood before the engraved stone, fingers tracing letters that finally proved their loved ones had existed, had mattered, had not simply vanished into thin air. Sarah attended the ceremony in uniform. She stood in the back, hands clasped behind her, listening to the speeches about sacrifice, honor, and truth. Words that felt both hollow and holy. Afterward, Mrs. Vega hugged her again, whispering, "Now he can rest." Sarah didn't reply. She wasn't sure rest was possible. Not for them. Not for her. She still dreamed of Carnes. In the dreams, he crawled from the river, dripping water, his eyes lit with that same cold smile. Sometimes he said nothing. Sometimes he repeated the word containment until it echoed like thunder. She would wake gasping, her hand reaching for the revolver she kept by the bed. Always empty air. Always silence. No body had ever surfaced. The state called it a closed case. Sarah called it unfinished. Men like Carnes didn't just disappear. One crisp autumn evening, Sarah drove out to Carter Bridge again. The new granite marker gleamed in the fading light. She parked at the shoulder, got out, and leaned against the railing. The river was quiet now, only a faint ripple breaking its surface. She tossed a pebble into the current, watched the rings spread and vanish. "You're not gone, are you?" she murmured. The water gave no answer. She thought of Micah Carraway, the father who had betrayed and redeemed himself in the same breath. He had survived his surgery, but refused to testify. Too many ghosts, too much shame. Sarah sometimes wondered if he was the only person who truly understood what it meant to live in Carnes's shadow. As dusk deepened, she pulled a notebook from her coat pocket. Inside were names, dates, fragments of interviews. She had started it weeks ago. A new case, another disappearance, older than Mercer and Vega, tied to the same roads, the same forgotten corners of the county. She had promised herself she wouldn't stop with one victory. Truth wasn't a single match. It was a fire you had to keep feeding, or the darkness returned. She wrote one last line across the page. "No one disappears without leaving a shadow." Then she closed the book, tucked it back into her pocket, and looked once more at the river. Behind her, traffic hummed over the bridge. Ahead, the horizon glowed with the last threads of daylight. Sarah turned toward her car, her steps steady. Whatever shadows remained, she would face them. Not for herself, not even for Mercer and Vega, but because silence had ruled Pine Bluff for too long, and she would not let it return.